Okay, thanks a lot. So I'm going to be talking about continuous documentation and why the best time is now. As an engineer myself, who's now focused a lot on architecture, I know this is the one topic that a lot of us don't want to deal with. So I'm sorry, but we just have to talk about it anyways. But yeah, hello, terve. I'm practicing my Finnish, so. Okay, I'm Kenigbolo Meya Steven. I'm the front-end engineering lead at Bcaster, and I'm an conveyor and community manager for the Coder Freak. The Coder Freak is a weekend-intensive software engineering bootcamp, free, that we run, and the idea is to try to get marginalized folks into tech. You can find me on Twitter at ExpensiveStevie. The caveat here is don't ask me about that handle, because I'm not going to explain. And I tweet a lot of stuff about diversity and inclusion, so if you're not comfortable with that, you probably do not want to follow me. But with that being said, let's get into the talk for today. So yes, this is the singular reason why I came to Finland. So after my master's, I was thinking about going back to London, which I really didn't want to. And then my wife says to me, this isn't going to work. It's either you move to Finland or this marriage is not going to work. If you are married to a Finnish woman, you actually know the situation I was in. So this is how I found myself here. But yes, what we'll be talking about today, what continuous documentation is, why it's important, the common pitfalls in current documentation practices, how to improve by implementing continuous documentation, and lastly, continuous documentation moving forward. So another important caveat, this is actually a lengthy series, and I'm not going to be able to cover the entire context of this talk within this time. So I'm going to try to skip as much as possible, but still share vital information. However, if you want to see a full version of this talk, you can actually find it on YouTube. This talk was available from the API Days conference a few weeks ago. That was held, if I recall, in France, actually, in Paris. So there's a full 60-minute session about this. So if you're interested, you can as well go. But today, I'm just going to focus on the most important parts of that talk and share. So what is continuous documentation? Let's, about random, if does anyone have any idea what this would actually mean? Okay, what do you think it means? Okay, actually, that's pretty much it. We have an academic definition, but that's pretty much what it means. So when I joined Bcaster, I became front-end engineering lead, and one thing that was important for us was to basically ensure, pardon me, I've been using basically so much, but it was to ensure that we synced every sprint that's closed, which had business logic changed, with every doc that we had, both internally and externally. This was challenging, this is still challenging, this is still an evolving practice, and this is why I'm sharing this. So the general idea of continuous documentation is that you ensure that not just the code you have, but the business logic around that code actually is reflected in your docs, either internally or externally. The idea here is that the language you might use to present a specific business case in your documentation, for example, explaining how it's supposed to be used, could be significantly different when the business case changes. How did we find this out? At Bcaster, our business model has changed quite a lot in the last 2 years. And this generally meant that you could go from B2C to B2B. The code base might not necessarily change that much, but the language in which the developers who are going to implement your widgets or your tools, for example, the language you use needs to change, else it doesn't reflect what your company is actually selling at the moment. So in our industry, change occurs so fast that sometimes it's difficult to catch all of it. It's the same case for documentation. Unfortunately, release notes alone do not quote it. And I know this because, okay, yeah, the guys at Microsoft also had the same problem, and the release notes were not just, it wasn't enough. I'm not going to comment further on that for security reasons. Okay, open source world, we use requests for comments. what we do here is basically when we say we have this new feature, we want people to actually give us their ideas. We want to listen to what they have to say. This is also used for reference internally when designing a spec, for example. So this is actually good. The problem that comes with this is that they're rarely summarized. And a good example was the RFC for the Vue.js composition API. When that RFC was actually released, it had like 3 different revisions, and if you needed to make a summary, it was almost impossible because there were over 1,000 comments. And some people were just saying, pardon my French, fuck this shit. We're not supposed to have this in Vue. Vue is going to be like React, and it's not so constructive, right? So you can't really base internal decisions on something like this. However, it's also useful, and it's imperative that you actually have it, especially if you work on open source tools. But the problem with every documentation that you would encounter in any company is change, another change, and even more changes. As your documentation evolves, a lot of the times you don't really have so much emphasis on improving the documentation. And this is okay. Everyone makes that mistake. It's totally fine, right? But the truth is it's actually not fine. So why is it important? The reasoning behind a change you fail to document today might become lost forever, resulting in a knowledge base gap. What you end up having is an unsynchronized knowledge base. Where this actually becomes a problem is when you hand over code, especially if you work in a project where you're alone, you're the single developer. And I can understand this because part of the consultancy work I do usually means that I'm responsible for a specific part of the code base. And if you're not careful, you write the code in such a way that just you yourself understand, which is okay. We always say like code should be explanatory, but again, that's very subjective. What is explanatory to me, to the next person, does not necessarily mean it will be understandable for the other person. So what we do in that case is you're assuming how people would understand your code and say, okay, yeah, I can write this. This is quite clear. I follow the standard principles, but it doesn't always work like that. And another problem where you would encounter this is if you go to a company that doesn't have documentation, then you actually understand the importance of writing those, because you probably would need 2-3 weeks, a month to onboard yourself to the project, and then you need another month to actually understand what the project is all about. So before you get productive, it's 3 months. And I don't know about other engineers, but some people can lose interest pretty fast. So let's look at typical documentation types. You have proprietary software where the docs are included and maintained. This is a pretty common and very good type of documentation. You have the popular frameworks where you have dedicated teams for docs. Not all popular frameworks have dedicated docs, but most of them do. And then you have your company. So let's take a random guess. If the developers at your company actually write the docs, can you indicate? Okay, that's such few hands. Oh my God, we're in trouble. Okay, if you have a dedicated documentation team, yeah, you need to be in a billion-dollar company to be able to afford that. Okay, so generally this brings the question: how do you actually handle your documentation? Let's look at the common pitfalls in current practices. If you just said to yourself, that's for those who raise their hands, like, we're definitely doing it right, then trust me, you're actually doing it wrong. That's the first thing. Documentations can never be perfect. They always need to be improved, and that's why we have continuous documentation. So let's look through. This is how good your documentation is, and then at that last point, the moment you get the moment you feel so comfortable, and the moment you feel that, oh, this is like banger and this is absolutely fantastic, that's actually where you're making the mistake. So whenever you feel your docs are too good, maybe you're making actually a huge mistake. Now, let's look at simple things you're probably doing wrong. READMEs. If majority of your code documentation are mostly in your readme.md documents, I'm sorry, but you're not helping. And this is the case for a lot of projects. We just have one README file, we churn as much information as we want into that file, and that's it. Now, there are certain cases where one README file would actually quote it, right? But I'm pretty sure when you're working on a code base that probably has multiple interfaces, implement in different classes, one README alone does not actually quote it. Now, let's look at unhelpful phrasing. Who uses a word checker for their documentation? Okay, quite few hands, which means there's a lot of room for improvement as well. Does anyone know what an unhelpful phrase is? Yep. So there are a lot of minor things that happen with documentation we don't focus a lot on, but are actually very important. So just to make it clear, like, if your answer to any of those questions in your heart was no, then it means that there's a lot of room for improvement in your documentation. Inconsiderate writing. This is the trickiest part, and the last 6 months, I have detached myself from engineering because I suffered a personal loss, so I was taking up some time, personal time. And during this period, I did a lot of consultancy for helping companies improve their documentation, and this was the one part that was the trickiest because there's so many things in this angle that you don't think of, but they exist. So let's look at it this way. Can you take your documentation and give to a non-technical person and expect them to make sense of it? If you say, but it's a technical doc, yeah, you're just assuming. Because if I'm a newbie, I go to your docs, and this is the first time I'm working in software engineering. I just go out of college, for example. My understanding is not going to be the same as someone who doesn't understand. I, as an architect, do not expect a junior developer to understand every technical jargon I ship out, which is why I try as much as possible not to use technical jargon in documentation. So let's look at READMEs. READMEs are supposed to be an entry point to your documentation as opposed to it being your main documentation. So if your README files are the main documentation in your projects, you probably need to change it. If you're having more than 3 sections in your README, that already signifies that there's a lot of information that needs to be somewhere else. Like I said, the READMEs are supposed to be an entry point to your documentation, not your actual docs. So ever heard about clutter? That's exactly what extensive READMEs are. And I know this for sure because a lot of my time is spent teaching beginners, people who are transitioning into tech. Some of them are coming from a law background. Some of them are coming from marketing background. The moment they go to that doc and in the first 3 sections, they can't actually find what they're looking for or a link to what they're looking for, they're literally not as interested as they would want to be. They're not as enthusiastic as they would want to be. So it's actually important, and there are better ways of actually handling this. And we would look at those. Okay, that was unnecessarily slow. So yeah, when you go back to work, if you have everything in the READMEs, maybe you should just do this. Well, don't say I said you should do this, but maybe it's time to actually remove most of that information. So let's look at unhelpful phrasing. Simply run the test. Who actually uses this? On Docs, on Slack, anywhere. I know because I used it a lot myself previously. Then you have this one. Just write the compile and then it works. If you work with Go, and by Go I mean Golang, this is something we often say, which is personally for me quite embarrassing, and it's something I've brought up in the community. But it's supposed to seem like an inside joke. However, this is really unhelpful because this doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't make any sense to anyone either. Simply, just simple, actually, easily, obviously. There are a lot of these words, a lot of these phrases, and you might not even know that you have them. But what this does is assume that the other person actually understands. I can give you a practical example. One of my students got to a doc. I can't name the doc here because it's quite popular, and some people might give me a lot of stick. But going through it said, all you need to do is simply this. Now, this is someone who's transitioning from marketing into writing code. He tried it, and it didn't work. And he ended up feeling like he wasn't caught out to be in this industry. Right. It didn't seem like anything to the person who actually wrote it, but so unknowingly, you're actually disenfranchising someone who would actually want to be in the industry. You have said simply, the person has tried to do it. It didn't work for the person, so they're assuming that if you say this thing is simple, and they cannot get it done, then maybe they're not smart enough, right? So words like this, easily, try as much as you can to avoid them. I know initially it's difficult, but in the long run, it actually helps everybody. Now let's look at inconsiderate writing. So gender favoring. Hey guys, he, he's, dude. except you work in an all-boys club, please try as much as you can never to have this kind of things in your documentation. Especially the pronouns. Please try as much as possible not to have them. They would cause you way more problems than they would solve, trust me. So avoid race-related phrases. This is a tricky one, and this is one I actually found in a project I was consulting for in the US. So I'm going to share that as well, because it was really tricky, but also very important. And polarizing and unequal phrasing. This, unfortunately, comes from senior architects and senior engineers as well. It has always been like that. This is the biggest BS excuse ever for anything. Never have this in your docs. Never use this in communication. Now, at this point, it's important to point out that documentation is a form of communication, and communication is a two-way street. So if you are passing information and the other person is actually not understanding, it doesn't matter how good you think your documentation is, you're actually not communicating. So you have failed at the primary purpose of having a docs. Now let's look at how you can improve via continuous documentation. So the first key here is that preconceptions are evil. This is something I've taught myself over and over again for the last 2 years. Whatever you think is correct does not necessarily mean it's correct. You always need to be flexible to other approaches to actually improve your documentation. Always remember, documentation is a form of communication. Communication is a two-way street. If your documentation is ambiguous, you have actually failed to communicate. You have failed the primary purpose of having docs. So the process is easy. You make a change, you document those changes, but this is not the important part. The last, but the most important part of this process is this. You screen the updated docs. And I will talk a little bit about this towards the end. But let's look at READMEs, how you can improve them. First, ensure your document is in Markdown format. Now, this is no hard rule, but I have seen generally that this is the one format that people actually find it easier to get on. I'm not saying it's easy, but it might be easier for a lot of people. Badges, they're good and very informative. If you're working on an open source project, I strongly advise that you have some CI badges there. It gives people subconsciously the confidence. When you see that it's green, you feel like, okay, yeah, this is probably a very good project. This is actually maintained, even if you haven't updated the code in 2 years. Okay, let's look at another one. But this is the important part that we use now. Create a separate folder for docs in every repository that you have. Markdown documents can be used to link to other Markdown documents. This is actually possible. Markdown gives you the possibility to do that. So your README docs should just be an entry point, and every other thing should be a section that you can actually reference in your docs folder. So your README should contain simply description, getting started, installation instructions, and maybe in important cases, some code examples how to get started. But that should be it. Most of every other thing you think you have there should be in the docs folder, because they would possibly change frequently. Okay, let's look at unhelpful phrasing. So documentations are a tool for communication as opposed to a place to expand your ego, right? Do not assume that everyone using the doc that you write is as skilled as you are. You need to understand, which is why I find it very important to give docs to non-technical people, because they can actually help you make sense of the language and syntax you have actually used. Call a non-technical person. It's very important. For me, in my case, it's most important. We actually give now the docs to the business people to actually read. If they can't make sense of it, then we know that something is definitely wrong in the grammar, the lexis and structure in terms of how we've actually written it. Review documentation changes just as you review your code. It's equally as important. Now, the biggest mistake we make as engineers is to see documentation as a post-coding activity. It is not. It should be part of your life cycle. And this is another thing I discovered while working, basically helping out the company with the documentation in Germany. They have added a documentation review process to their CI pipeline. So if you change a method that's actually reflected in the docs itself, you can't go through that particular file doesn't go through CI until someone comes, looks through it, and says, okay, this has been properly documented. Now, initially, it was a bit of a pain in the ass when I asked them to implement this, but in the long run, it has actually saved them. Of course, you don't want a situation where you need to wait for somebody to review your pull request and then review your documentation. So there are different ways you can actually walk through it, but it's very important that if a change is made, a significant change, do not push that change to production until the documentation is updated. So let's look at inconsiderate writing. This is the tricky one, and this is something I discovered in the US. And a little bit of background. So this company has been in existence for about 20 years. A lot of the guys there were pretty old school. I'm talking about some really bearded, they're not Viking or anything. Americans are not Vikings, but some pretty old, probably my dad's age. My dad probably would be, okay, no, maybe not my dad's age. Father would be like 75. So, but they were more like 50s and 60s, right? There were a lot of things in their documentation that they didn't actually think were inconsiderate or plain white disgusting. And I had to go through and point out a lot of this to them. And of course, I got the feedback, but it has always been like this. And then I said, yes, I agree that these things have been in existence, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be that way. As engineers, we're actually in a position to make significant change, not just in our industry, but in the world. So I think it's important that we actually take this into consideration. Now, the first one was, don't you think primary replica sounds better than master-slave? Now, as somebody who comes from an Afro background, master-slave has been in tech for as long as I can remember. In DevOps, I started my career from networking, so this is a phrase I have been around for the past 10 years I've been in tech. Now, when you think about it, it's not something that would come to mind as, oh, this is probably not a good idea, because we use it a lot. I also used it a lot. But when you're in the US, it's a different case. When you're in London, this might not be so much of a problem. But when you're in the US, and then you have engineers coming from different backgrounds, considering the history, this is not something you should have. The whole idea of master-slave is basically primary, secondary, primary replica. So why don't we use English language? Well, Americans don't really speak English language the way I like. No disrespect. I think British English and American English are very diverse, in my opinion. But primary replica sounds much better than saying master-slave. And I brought this up with Sean, who is a senior architect at Microsoft and my personal mentor as well. He taught me everything I know about architecture. And I brought this up because Microsoft were actually the first people to actually start using this. So if you have this in your documentation, all I'm saying is please change it. If I come to work with your company, I come to consult for you, and I see this, it will be a bit insulting to me. So probably this is not a good idea. I know it's been around for like ever, but it doesn't mean it has to be this way. Let's look at another one. Whitelist, blacklist. Well, obviously I'm black, as everyone can see. So if I come to your docs and I see blacklist, and you're basically saying, blacklist are those we don't want to be able to access our service, and whitelist are the IPs we want to be able to access our service. Yeah, I'm guessing a lot of people are thinking about this now. So, but again, this is something that has been around even before I started my career in tech. But it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be this way. This is what we refer to in continuous documentation as inconsiderate writing. What we are basically trying to, basically again, oh my lord. What we are technically trying to say is we want to allow this set of IPs to be able to access our service. We want to deny this set of IPs to be able to not to be able to access our service. It's very tricky because when you hear something like denial of service, we don't say blacklisting of service. But when we come to simple phrases like this, we go whitelist, blacklist. Again, like I said, this is nobody's fault. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. This has been around even before I got into tech. But my point is, it doesn't have to be like this. Now, doesn't here every... Yep.
What about white box, black box testing?
Yeah, that's also... we can go on and on. There are tons of them. I don't really have enough time to go through a list, but we can talk after this and I can point out a lot of them. But yeah, another very important thing is, hey everyone, this sounds much better than using, hey guys, hey dude. What's up, people? There are a lot of different ways. So if you need to actually personalize documentation in any sense, try as much as you can to avoid gender-favoring phrases. So I'm guessing now you're already thinking, he already thought about one. So I know there are a lot of other things. We don't have enough time to go into them, and I need to... Okay, my time is almost up, so I need to rush through this. But yeah, there are tons of other things that we can go through here, and we can look at this later on. But yeah, just a quick summary. Release notes are nice. You should have them. I believe that it's very important, both for your developers and people who actually want to see, especially for IT audits, this is also quite important. So you should have release notes, regardless of if you decide to do versioning or not. Although I don't know why you wouldn't do versioning, but yeah. So there's no such thing like too much of good documentation. If there's a reasonable change somewhere, there should be a corresponding documentation update to show that change. Auto-generating documentation from code it's actually okay, it's good. But it can miss a lot of things because your auto-generators do not have word checkers, they do not have phrase checkers. So while it's good, it's still also imperative, in my opinion, in my professional opinion, that you still go ahead to actually review your docs. The same way you treat your code and your code reviews, you should do the same for your docs. Your docs should be of the same quality and high quality as your code, or probably better quality than your code as well. So moving forward. Continuous documentation is all about continuous improvement, documentation practices. There's no unified tool out there. So currently what we're working on is a spec that enforces certain standards but are flexible enough to actually be configurable. We're building this with basically again, oh my God. We're building this with Node, but we're also trying to build a Rust version which should technically allow you to be able to use it across any project whatsoever and not going to be peculiar to JavaScript. But as front-end engineering lead, my primary focus is JavaScript and TypeScript, so we're first building a Node CLI package, first of all. We're also working on a few browser add-ons for both Chrome and Mozilla. And the idea with those is that also to get your non-technical people to actually be able to use it as well. So the DOCLINT target platforms, a JavaScript.js package, there's a Rust CLI package, and of course, we need to target browsers as well. This could also help you, maybe not necessarily in documentation, but the browser versions could actually help you in things that you have on your website that you probably would not think about. But yeah, so we would have browser extensions. So if you're interested in helping out, please feel free to hit me. I have a demo spec already on GitHub. I've been working with 2 different people on trying to create the spec. We are kind of a mini TSC. The problem with building this and just building it in-house is that you wouldn't get quality feedback from the open source community. So I want to build this in such a way where it will be useful not just for the use cases surrounding wherever I work or my peculiar use cases, but also for others as well. So if you're interested, you can write me on Twitter, GitHub, or anything, and we can just chat about it. But that's it for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Yes.
Can you hear me? So, my name is Richard. Thank you so much for a great talk. Very inspiring, very interesting. And I'm a developer of a few open source libraries, and I definitely understand how important documentation is. And couldn't agree more with pretty much everything you said here. A few notes which I would rather add is to me seems like you said about the README file that it's better to put everything into like organized folders and split it into sections. I would respectfully disagree with that. I think it depends on the project. For example, another approach is to put everything into one file, but have the table of contents at the top, so you can quickly navigate through it. So basically jumping back and forth on the same file. So would you like to would like to hear a few comments from you about that? What do you think of this approach? And I don't think there is like a right way, because I've seen a lot of libraries doing that or doing like you said. And another thing which I'm also thinking a lot is that there is kind of the best documentation is when it goes closer to the code. If it's like very deep technical, so that you can annotate the methods and give the API documentation, well, that obviously gets injected into your code completion tools and so forth, into your IDE automatically. So that's something interesting to think about. And another benefit of that is that once you update the code, you have to update the docs as well, because they are close, and you see if they don't match, you have to really you change it, because otherwise it would be really bad to commit only with the methods, but not updating the actual docs, which are just above the method. So I think that keeps it a bit more consistently. And of course, that's one benefit you mentioned about the open source, starting the project in the open source, that the needs of many people shape the project in a way it becomes more robust, more tailored to generic usage. And in a way, I think it could be easier tailored to internal needs as well. So that was my experience with my library, which I developed. I got so much requests and started document only what people actually started to ask, and documentation pretty minimal, but the project got really popular because of that. So just enough to start, and then you have to ask, and I'll document if on as needed basis. Yep. So would like to hear a few comments on this.
Okay, so thank you very much, actually. So when you talk about READMEs and README files, it's totally okay to have them sectionized. That's actually one approach. The downside is when you have, let's take a random, let's just think out of the box. Let's say we have a file with 3,000 lines, a huge project. So that's, like I mentioned initially, it's project specific. There are some projects where you don't necessarily need to have a docs folder. If the project itself is not that large, then you don't. But like I said, when you have multiple classes and multiple interfaces that need to interact, you probably don't want to have one README file handling all this information, because over time it will become close to unmaintainable actually, and this would actually hurt you in the long run. That's on the README side. Your second question, if I understood correctly, is regarding. Let me try to phrase it properly. Regarding seeking opinions for the project from the open source community, I think for me this is like super important, and this is why we haven't made like huge technical decisions as it regards this project. What we have done is make this CLI in such a way that it actually suits our internal needs currently, but also flexible enough to actually open it up. So it's a lot like you would have in ESLint, where a lot of rules are actually configurable. So you can decide what you allow or not, but as usual, we would have standard defaults, and basically just, so if you take ESLint, for example, you have the Airbnb style, you have the Google style, and this is the entire idea we're trying to build out, where everyone can actually have their own customized defaults. So you can go with the defaults, or you can actually put a doclint.rc or doclint.json file, which we would read from, and use those to actually do the linting for you. So, of course, currently, I wouldn't say it's perfect. It's nowhere near perfect. I don't even think that there's any tool that can ever be perfect, because changes occur in our industry. So that's the whole idea. We're trying to get more ideas. We had the brainstorming session in Paris in December at the API Days conference regarding this, myself and a few of the lads from HashiCorp. So they have actually cloned it, and they're actually working on their own side, something internal, and when they're done, we would actually compare also and see which ones were more peculiar to the two, and then push that out. That will be the base of what we will start working on. Yep. Yeah. Definitely, definitely.
And another thing is that people have really different needs, and you have to have one guy or two people there
Syncing, yeah.
leaders who shape the overall structure of the open source project, integrate all of that, because no person will ever who wants to apply the change, request the change, no person will integrate the other approach because they don't have the full view of the
Let's go, yeah.
system. But there should be one or two people who are really not so contributing much, but they sort of give a vision and consult collaborators, and that's probably an interesting approach of working when you talk a bit, discuss a feature, and then people will start implementing them, which don't see the big picture, but they have the guidance from above, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. So currently Sean actually takes that lead at Ashikop. He's basically my contact person, and I discuss with him, well, not as frequently as I would like, of course. He's in the US time zone, so. But yeah, that's the idea we're trying to shape. And we're also trying to get a few more people on board. I think for me, having companies, especially in my opinion, Microsoft, who have had good documentation practices for a very long time, having them on board is quite important, which is why I've been discussing with Tom as well a lot. And then the guys at LinkedIn as well have also been having very good documentation, so those are also resource people. But again, it's early stages, so it's going to take a while. It's not something that's going to boom in 2020 or anything, but I would rather we take the time and build it properly, that it serves a long-term purpose, than ship something out so quickly just because. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any experience with specific documentation generation tools from using something like JSDoc on methods and other ways in order to generate from them the documentation? Do you have any experiences on specific tools that you would recommend or not recommend?
Well, I wouldn't want to say not recommend for obvious reasons, but yeah, I think a lot of the documentation generation tools you can find are quite good. The problem, well, JSDoc, for example, is a good starting point. The problem, in my opinion, is there's a lot of limitations, that's one. And number two, there are a lot of things that can go under the radar. Your JSDoc, to have JSDoc work the way you would want it to work, you basically would need to have a speed checker as well, because JSDoc basically takes what you write anyways. It's not really linting anything for you per se. It's not going to help you catch unhelpful phrasing. It's literally not going to help you catch anything. It's more like Gigo. So whatever you give it is what it spits out in a proper format in that sense. So I think, in my opinion, documentation generating tools are not just enough at this moment. You need to combine them at least with the word checker. You need to find a way to actually, at generation time, filter out those issues. You need to find a way to link these docs. I think that's the problem now we're trying to solve, because currently we need to use 3 different tools in order to ship one doc, but it's better if we have them integrated. And a simple problem with something like this would be, if I write on my docs, say Black Ops, right? Maybe I'm actually referencing something, and on the tool we just say anytime you see black, change it to color black. So imagine it goes from Black Ops, which makes sense, to color Black Ops, which would probably not make any sense, right? So it's a bit challenging. I can't really say, which is why I didn't want to recommend any documentation generating tool, because they solve a problem, but they don't actually solve the continuous documentation problem. They solve one part of the problem, which is generating the docs, right? But linking those docs and making sure those docs actually correspond, that's not really, that's not what they're built for, yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the CI.
Okay.
So I think that's the continuous part. So how do you link the documents to the CI, and what do you do if document doesn't link directly to any method in the code?
Okay, so that's
Number of those.
that's not, it's not privileged information, so I can share. What's done at the company in Germany right now is they have a script, one script. It's a simple JS script. Actually, no, it's a bash script. Oh no, it's actually a JS script. Okay, yeah, it's a JS. And when their pipeline runs and all the tests are actually green, they use Bitbucket pipelines, so they trigger that script. And what that script does is it goes through a file, gets all the different methods, and then goes through the docs and checks if it actually has the corresponding method. So you can't, how this works is that you cannot introduce a new function without having the docs for them. So if, to make it a bit more clear, say you're using JSDoc, right? You cannot have a new function without having the JSDoc annotation on that function.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. And how about the second question? Like if there is, for example, we are documenting best practices or whatever else, it doesn't link directly to any of our methods, but it's a very important part of documentation, and we want to have it visible and always updated.
Yeah, and then those are files that you can actually add to the skip list. So it's, like I said, it's a script. You basically, it will check the files that you give it to it. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that it seems that you are mixing code documentation with other kinds of documentation, which is
documentation,
not
yeah,
the best.
But the question
Because
was, different
there are
types of
very different kinds of documentation, and
yeah, his question was about code documentation, I'm assuming. Yep.
I just have a cool idea for you, like, because you mentioned the black box, white box testing.
Yeah.
Like, you probably know the framework Appium.
Yep.
And they have repositories in GitHub. So if you could make a PR to them, like, you know, replace like to black box testing to out of the box testing or something like that.
Yeah.
And then let's see what kind of, you know, conversation starts there, because that would be very interesting.
I can't show you a link because we have deleted it, but this would bring more problems than you can imagine, trust me. It's a tricky subject, right?
Yeah.
It's something that some people have very strong opinions about. Some people, the older, let me not use older generation, but those who have been around much longer than I have do not see a problem with this because it's been that way and it wasn't a problem for them now. So we, the, what are we called, millennials? The millennials generation, we're seen as being pushy, you know, and the boomers think about it differently, right? So, no disrespect, anyways. I think boomers are just anyone you don't like, so that's fine. They think about it differently. I tried once to bring up this conversation, the whitelist, blacklist. In one community, it didn't go well at all. In the Ember community, it actually did go well, so well that they don't use any of these words. And if you highlight something, instantly, they take that feedback on board and see how they can actually change. But the community needs to be receptive. Some communities are not receptive. Some communities are just about ego inflating and, you know, ego posting. So, yeah.
Thanks, great talk.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, nice throw. So, one quick question. So I think we can all probably benefit from being a little bit more strict and a little bit better about our documentation. But what would your idea be for somebody like me who is working on a project that's not really well documented? Let's say I start on one thing tomorrow. What would that be?
I think the first thing you should do is actually map out what is not documented. That's the fastest way to go. The mistake would be trying to document them one by one. It will seem like it will be faster, but no. I'm pretty sure, well, I have seen code bases that had no documentation at all, and I want to believe that's not what you're working on, right? Okay, yeah, because if that's it, then you should send it back. But yeah, so there definitely would be some form of documentation. So the first phase is taking inventory. Know what you have and what you don't have, and then from what you don't have, you make a priority list, right? if it's the installation instructions, now I'm not talking about code documentation, I'm talking about general documentation in terms of repository. If it's the getting the repository to work, the Docker instructions or whatever, you start with that. Setup instructions in general. If it's about the code, then you take my rule of thumb. Generally, if I go to an API and I actually, let's say a particular route, say media, for example, has 20 different endpoints, which can be crazy, but it does exist. And then there's the one that has 5. I would generally start with the one that has 20 endpoints and document those because it uses more resources, it has more resources, so that's something that's a much bigger reference. And on that, you technically start going down. So it's like a priority list, and then you go. But first of all, take inventory of what you have and what you don't have. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any more? One more, last question.
That was close.
Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
I work at a company where we have multiple repositories which make up the whole project, and then we also have end users who don't have even access to the repositories which read the end user documentation. I know you didn't really tackle the people who might be using the end software instead of people who set up the repositories, but do you have any picture or like take on that, how to make documentation that has screenshots and text and how to update all of that when the code changes? For example, if you make front-end code, then the front-end is going to look different next time. How do you regenerate all the screenshots?
Okay. This is also another tricky one. So we currently have used both VuePress and Empress. VuePress is the one for Vue.js, Empress is the one for Ember.js. Both of them, they do not offer you the ability to actually have those changes. So again, it's more about responsibility, right? When you review, which is why I said at the initial stage, when you're trying to implement this, the last part, which is screen updated docs, is the most important. So when reviewing that code, you spend the time reviewing those docs as well, and you look at those screenshots also. You need to check if they actually reflect what you currently have or if it's different. This is important because the docs.bcaster.com public docs, we try as much as we can to update the screenshots every time, because a lot of times you might add new features, for example, to your dashboard, and the place where they're supposed to get the credentials initially was the second tab, but now it's the third one. Your screenshot might still be reflecting the second tab, which is okay, they will still go and find, but if the order changes, then you have a screenshot that doesn't necessarily reflect what they will do. So that's why the screen updated docs is also a very important part of the process. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.